Welcome to Candid Conversations at Back Bay Mission. I am the Executive Director of Back Bay Mission, and this is our Tulane University intern for the whole school year.
Yep, I'll be finishing up at the end of April, beginning of May.
Oh, darn. This is Saren. Don't really want to see her go, because Saren has been an amazing addition to the staff. I really see Saren as kind of the staff, not so much as an intern, even though she does what she does, not getting paid, right? But really very wise, getting her MSW, and has some really wisdom and knowledge around a lot of topics that partially we also share together, some interests, intrigue, and try to have depth of knowledge, right? So, Saren, we welcome you to Candid Conversations. And for our supporters of Back Bay Mission, or people that watch these on a regular basis, we really wanted to open the conversation up around inclusivity and diversity. And Back Bay Mission has been an organization that was kind of birthed out of the United Church of Christ about 100 years ago, before it was actually called the United Church of Christ. The United Church of Christ has always valued diversity and equity, and everybody is welcome, and there's no judgments on individuals for who and what they are, right? And so today we're going to be talking about LGBTQIA issues, pronouns, and especially kind of expand maybe our understanding, because there's been a lot kind of in the marketplace, a lot in the news. Not only has there been a lot in the news around the critical race theory, which, as I shared before, I think a lot of folks don't really understand the definition of critical race theory and don't understand that it's much more of a legal term. And as you mentioned, Google Derek, I forgot his last name.
Derek Bell.
Derek Bell. Google Derek Bell. He's a lawyer who was the one who really established critical race theory. And you'll be very confused, right? Because it's high-level stuff. But there's been a lot of discussion in our culture and in our world and in our homes and in our churches and in places of employment around LGBTQIA issues. I think especially around trans issues, around restrooms, and around how people identify, gender identity, pronouns. And I think it's really important that we at Back Bay Mission stay on the cutting edge, and actually I would prefer us to be kind of in the forefront, leaders around diversity and these issues when it comes to LGBTQIA. And I'm probably not quite adding enough letters to that, I'm not sure. But that's kind of currently what we call it. And as somebody who used to work more directly in this field at the LGBT community centers, it was called back in Milwaukee, and in AIDS service organizations, it was really important to keep ourselves aware and abreast of probably most current developments around gender identity, around pronoun usage, just to make sure that we're welcoming of all. And it's not just welcoming in a phony, half-hearted sense, but fully welcoming and fully embracing and accepting people wherever they're at on the journey. So that kind of opens up the candid conversation. And you, from your perspective, what would you like to share about kind of what I call generically kind of the queer community or the gender non-conforming community? Mm-hmm. What would you have to share about that, and how could you kind of share that with our audience that's joining us today?
Yeah, so I think for me, the umbrella terms I prefer to use are usually queer and trans, just because they encompass so many different identities within those two terms.
And can I interrupt you?
Yeah, go
ahead.
ahead.
Interesting thing about that word queer, I remember in my previous congregation at First Church back in Phoenix, I started to use the word queer for the LGBT community and trans. And I remember there were specifically older gay men who were really disturbed by the word queer, because it was used as kind of a terse term, or say, well, you're awfully queer, or you're queer, and it was negative. But it's a term that we kind of re-embrace.
Yeah, it's something that people have collectively kind of taken ownership of and reclaimed to be able to use it in positive terms and build a community based around that identity. I personally identify as queer. I feel like it encompasses my identity the best way, but I know other people, they prefer to still use terms like gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, And all those terms can be found under umbrellas like LGBT, LGBTQIA, and those kind of terms. So there's no real specific term that you need to know how to use, but it's important to kind of have an idea of what are the acceptable terms.
Well, the interesting thing is back in the day when I was at an AIDS service organization, part of an AIDS service organization working out of the Marathon County Health Department in Wisconsin, and then the Madison Health Department was creating safe spaces for queer identified youth, or back then it was gay or lesbian youth, or trans youth, or non-gender conforming youth, to be able to be safe, and not contract HIV or other sexually communicative diseases, and so we started these groups we called rainbow clubs, because the rainbow flag has always been somewhat indicative of our community, because it's the diversity, right? It's the different, it's the diversity of the rainbow. So you call yourself queer. What does that mean to you?
For me, queer just encompasses I can be attracted to a range of gender identities. So anyone who is a male, female, trans, non-binary, anybody. So it's just kind of the term that feels most comfortable to me. I think other people may call it bisexual or pansexual, but those terms don't speak to me as much, and I think part of it is the sexual nature of those terms. I like to think of it in a broader sense as also romantic feelings. So yeah, queer is just the term that feels most comfortable to me, and a lot of people I've been in community with and a lot of my friends also prefer that term, so it's the one that stuck.
I've always thought, with that term in particular, that all of us are a bit queer, right? All of us are different. We have different ways of expressing ourselves, and we need to have the freedom to be able to express ourselves as we see ourselves, as we understand ourselves. And that's been, I think, one of the interesting things in the news and kind of in the media, and again, depending upon which news or media you listen to, is young people or teenagers or adolescents or even younger are identifying differently than the identity they were given at birth, right? And then how do we honor that and respect that? That's part of it, is honoring and respecting people's journeys and honoring and respecting how people identify. And one of those is, and this is, again, I don't know if this is relatively new, but it's been coming to the forefront a lot, and actually in our own community, that there are some that use the pronouns him, her, they, them, right? And I know when it comes to God, even as somebody who's clergy, I think we define God as God the Father. Now, kind of the Hebrew language didn't necessarily need to define God as either or, and when God defines God's self, God said, at least the story goes with the Israelites, I am who I am. I just am, right? And I think kind of that word queer, in a sense, I've always kind of likened it to the idea of I am. I am who I am, and I have the opportunity to identify myself how I want to identify, not allow somebody else to put an identity on me, correct?
Yeah, it's a flexible term. It can grow and change with you, whereas I think in the past people would kind of come out as gay or lesbian, and then maybe later would be even more confused because they're still in a certain box, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual. They've put themselves into a box that society has designed, whereas these kind of queer terms allow people to be more flexible with their sexuality and their gender identity, and not feel beholden to one identity or another.
Yeah, I think to me that's kind of the key, and that's why here at Back Bay we need to really be educated, we need to be schooled, we need to learn, and we need to embrace and allow people to identify how they identify. I know we have a couple of individuals that I've been told by the staff, and I've met one of them, that identify as transgender. that come for services at Micah Day. And for transgender individuals, it can be a pretty dangerous world out there, right? Because there's been a lot of trans violence, because people don't understand, people fear. And what you fear sometimes, sadly enough, it conjures up violence, right? Or naming or shaming or whatever it is. So say a little bit about the them and their kind of pronouns.
Sure. So yeah, probably most people by now have encountered this idea of pronouns within their media or their news or their social media. And so it's becoming increasingly visible that people are choosing to use alternative pronouns to he and she. And so it's really relevant that especially at an organization that serves a diverse community, that we understand those pronoun choices and why it's important to respect people's pronouns. So, I mean, from a basic level, everyone uses a pronoun. I personally use she, her pronouns. So when you're not calling me Saren, you're probably referring to me as she or her. And so whether you have specifically chosen your pronouns or not, most people have pronouns that they prefer to be referred to. If someone refers to me as he, him, I would probably be pretty confused, maybe a little weirded out by that. And I think most people can relate to that. You prefer to be called your correct pronoun. Now, where the confusion and some conflict has come up is using they them pronouns. So a lot of people who use they them pronouns identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming, which just means that their gender identity does not fit into one box of male or female, man or woman. They may have a fluid gender identity. They may feel not attached to gender at all, but they choose to go by they them to remove the gender from their pronouns. So if I was talking about someone who used they them pronouns, I may say, James came into the day center today and they told me that there's a staff meeting at 2:00. And it might not be intuitive to some people because many of us were taught in our English courses throughout our youth that they them is only a plural pronoun, but it's been used in singular ways for a long time and in different contexts. So it's something that may be difficult for people to kind of train themselves to do once you learn that someone does use they them pronouns. And you may slip up sometimes. You may refer to somebody by a pronoun that they don't identify as, and you have to kind of take a sense of humility there and being able to accept that you may have hurt their feelings or you may have slipped up a little bit, and be able to say, I'm sorry, let me correct that in your next sentence. So if I said, today I gave James their paperwork back, and James was like, oh, actually I use he, him pronouns, and I could say, oh, I gave James his paperwork back. So there's simple adjustments that you can make, and making those efforts really makes a difference for people who are from historically targeted and marginalized groups like trans people and queer people, to be able to feel welcome, to know that someone is thinking about them and their safety and comfort and identity can make a big difference.
That was beautifully put, actually. I think a really probably helpful explanation for what we're hearing kind of in our families, in the marketplace, I think for me, it's really, because like when we're born, we're oftentimes kind of put into a pink or blue box. And I think that can be challenging, because I remember as a child, there were times I struggled with my gender identity. You wonder what gender is, and then you move into adolescence and everything's whoosh, right? And I think these are really, really important discussions to have, especially as we honor the journeys of others and as we honor our own journey. and I appreciate you being able to kind of share this. And this is kind of our, we'll have some more candid conversations about this, but this is a great way to kind of introduce the topic, and especially here at Back Bay, as we seek to really accept people where they're at with no judgments, and to love people where they're at. And I don't always think I think sometimes these are topics we're afraid to ask. So we're afraid to ask, maybe if you say to somebody, well, I'm a part of the queer community. I think the best thing to do as well, if you're unfamiliar with that, is what does that mean to you? How do you understand that? Educate me, school me a bit, right? Because I think that's the only way we're going to really understand, quote, others, right? And not other them, but bring them into our fold and understand. And for me, I have a tattoo here, and this tattoo for me has kind of reminded me of the diversity within kind of religious thought. When I think about gender, I think about religion, and I think about religion being one of the things that can be really oppressive, right? And so this is Aramaic, this is Hebrew, and this is Greek, and it's a word for peace. And those are all the three Abrahamic religions that we call them. And I think for me, it's about really celebrating that diversity, celebrating the fact that God shows up, however God shows up in different ways, right? And you can call God God, the divine energy, Allah, whatever it is, he or she. And I think it's the same with our identities, And I think so often we put God in a box, we put ourselves in a box, and we don't allow ourselves to express our full selves, the image of who and what we believe we are. And for me, part of it is also this bumper sticker that I put on my window is diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance, right? That's what we really try to do here at Back Bay. And that's our ultimate goal. That's what we aspire to, is not just diversity, but full inclusion.
Yeah.
And so that's what. And kind of a closing question: what do you think full inclusion would look like from your perspective?
Yeah. I think often when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we focus on superficial measures of diversity, whether that's ensuring that a staff has diverse employees, or making sure that our statistics of who we're serving lines up with the community we're serving, things like that. But diversity alone does not speak to the different needs of marginalized communities. James mentioned earlier, trans and queer people have been historically targeted and have faced violence at the hands of their family members, have been forced to leave homes, are at a greater risk of homelessness, at a greater risk of homicide. So it's really important that we are creating these safe spaces, and it doesn't mean the same thing for every person. So I think inclusivity means truly making space for everyone to be who they are and tailoring our services to meet the varying needs of clients, because not every client is going to have the same needs, especially when you're serving a population that's really diverse. So I think when we say inclusivity, what we mean is that we are trying to create an environment where we can hold all those identities at once and prioritize everyone's safety and well-being within that space.
Wow, that was incredibly well said. Not that I would have expected anything less from you, but I think that's really the difference, right? With inclusion, it's just everybody's voice is heard. And I think back to when I became a pastor in the United Church of Christ, and I was moved up to Minneapolis to be pastor at Spirit of the Lakes United Church of Christ. And one of the members there was a 75-year-old trans woman by the name of Barbara Satin, who was on the board of directors of the United Church of Christ, and retired from 3M in Minneapolis, was a grandfather, but still with her grandchildren, she would identify as grandfather, not grandmother. And as the children were going to get older, she said, well, then I'll share my identity more fully with them, right? And kind of lived in this world and walked in this world, but was this huge advocate with the with GLSEN, actually. She did a lot of speaking for the Human Rights Campaign, did a lot of activism throughout the country around trans rights. Now that would have been 15 years ago now. And so this continues to really be on the cutting edge, the growing edge. And I don't even think a cutting edge, this is just a part of our culture and our society now, that as human beings we embrace diversity, and we need to understand diversity and at least understand the terminology to embrace it. So don't ever be afraid to ask. Don't ever be afraid to ask questions, right? Because I think people appreciate that. And I know I appreciate when people ask me questions for clarification. I know you do. I think it's just kind of the kind and the good and the human thing to do. So thank you for joining us for this episode of Candid Conversations, and we'll have future conversations. And again, I want to thank Saren for being open and willing to have this conversation, and just for her amazing work within Back Bay Mission. And it's not just me that thinks she's doing great work, it's all the folks over at the Micah Day Center, where she serves the homeless population, right? And like Saren said, a very high percentage, especially of queer identified LGBTQIA youth that are homeless, because oftentimes they're kicked out of their home or they don't feel it's safe. And it's a population that's definitely disproportionately affected by homelessness and all that homelessness brings. So thank you for your time and for your energy. And thank you for joining us. We appreciate you. If you have any questions or whatever, right, feel free to email or call. Thank you.